welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your fun host, Madelyn.
I'm your no fun allowed host, Emma.
And this week on Talk This, it's a side quest, and it's my turn to pick a topic for us to discuss for the next 45 to 55 minutes.
That seems like a low estimate based on how long our side quests have been.
50 to 63 minutes.
There you go.
And this week, I want to talk about fun.
No fun allowed.
Oh, that's the end of the episode, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter.
We don't have fun on Talk This.
Talk
Very
This
serious business.
It's a serious podcast. So specifically what I wanted to talk about, is fun in games. Not fun in games. And also fun and games.
And some fun in games.
like Funnin apostrophe.
Yes, like that.
Funnin.
Some fun in games.
Fun or games? Neither fun nor games? All the combinations we're going to be talking about on the show this week. And so there's a lot of different ways to approach that, but to talk a little bit about my inspiration for picking this topic is I feel like there's been a fair bit of discourse, at least across my Twitter this week, about games that don't necessarily provoke the usual fun/enjoyment, although we should talk about the definitions of those two things perhaps, that we've come to expect from particularly AAA games. And the major one of those, of course, is Kojima's now instant classic. Just kidding, we decided there were no instant classics. Instant polarizing masterpiece of urination, right? No doubt it is the best game that asks you to manage your character's urine, right?
Yeah.
I feel like that's an uncontroversial take.
The best thing about it is, it's not like he has, levels of needing to go to the bathroom. It's just, craft supplies. It's not survival mechanics, it's resource management.
Oh, no. Anyway, a lot of talk on Twitter over the past week about Death Stranding. One of the most anticipated games of the year, if not the past few years.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically about whether or not the game is fun.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't know about Death Stranding, I'll give a very tiny overall summary. You're like a futuristic UPS man, more or less, delivering packages across the wasteland that used to be America to isolated towns. And a lot of what that entails is you walking laboriously through the wilderness.
Yes.
I saw a good tweet of somebody just making it to the finish line and they're falling all over the place and stumbling and they're when you just make it to Friday. It was pretty good. He falls over with all of it, but he makes it.
Yeah.
So a lot of talk about that game and whether slowly walking through the wilderness with hundreds of pounds on your back in a game can really be considered fun. And also, did you hear about this game, Airplane Mode?
No, tell me about it.
Okay, so Airplane Mode, it's a game made by the people who do... Have you heard of Desert Bus?
No.
Okay, so Desert Bus is a game that it's part of Penn and Teller's Smoke and Mirrors, which is a video game that stars magician duo Penn and Teller for Sega. It was released in 1995. So it has a bunch of mini games on it, basically. And one of those mini games is called Desert Bus, which is Penn names as the best part of the collection. So in Desert Bus, you drive a bus in real time at 45 miles per hour from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas. Requires 8 continuous hours of gameplay.
Wow.
And there's no passengers on the bus. There's not really any scenery. It's completely straight road. But the bus veers a little bit, so you have to watch it all the time.
Wow.
And the game can't be paused.
Wow. Has anyone ever done that?
Well, yes. So the Desert Bus team, what they do basically is they'll continue to play Desert Bus as long as they get donations. So for the first hour that they play, they just have to get $1, but like the amount that they have to raise each hour to keep playing rises by I think 7% each time. So like, you know, for them to play for 2 straight weeks, it compounds into they'd have to raise like billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Anyway, the folks behind that charitable project, which I think is hilarious as a feat of terror, I believe, or it was at least announced on their thing. I guess I'm not 100% sure if they're the ones making this, but it was announced at Desert Bus. I think it has something to do with AMC, too. Anyway, airplane mode. You should watch the trailer, because it's, like, kind of funny. Basically, it's just a simulator of a 6-hour flight across the Atlantic in coach.
Mm-hmm.
So you just sit in an airplane seat. Taxi takeoff and landing. You can like track your flight on the little satellite tracker. You get snacks, you get your carry-on, you got like a crossword. You can watch things on the in-flight entertainment. And it's different each time. So randomized events such as turbulence, bad Wi-Fi, delays, crying babies.
Crying babies.
And the award-winning in-flight magazine, Stratospheres. Oh, and I guess it's from, I'm looking at it now, it's from AMC Games, IFC, Backronym, and the NYU Game Center Incubator.
Interesting.
So it's literally just a game that replicates the experience of a transatlantic flight. Not even as a pilot. Just sitting on
that game, there's already one where you can be a pilot, right? Like, there's all those simulators.
Well, there's all sorts of pilot simulators, yeah. But this one replicates what is it like to sit in coach. Sort of.
Just in case you were curious.
Meal service, including fish option, they say.
That's nice.
Steam. Anyway, it's coming in 2020, but they just announced it this week. And I thought it was fascinating as a game that, man, when you describe it, just does not sound fun. There are a few things that I like less than sitting on an airplane for 6 hours.
To be fair, you do get a crossword, so...
Yeah, and Sudoku, and movies from the 1930s.
Specifically from the 1930s?
That's what Steam says.
That's not usually what's on my in-flight entertainment, though, so I feel like my immersion would be ruined.
I think the licensing probably makes it tricky.
That's fair. Usually on the in-flight entertainment, they more have, like, movies that went out of theaters, like, 2 years ago, basically.
Exactly. Anyway, between seeing the trailer for that and reading all of the many and varied thoughts people have about Death Stranding, it made me want to talk about fun in games. And specifically, I mean, a lot of different questions here that we'll talk about in some order, but things that I've been thinking about, you know, of course, what makes a game fun? And what does fun even mean? That's something that I really found myself having to start to unpack over the course of my research, is what the F does fun even mean? It doesn't seem to mean anything, is mostly what I've come to. It means exactly what you want it to mean, and no more and no less than that.
Yeah, that's pretty much my understanding of it, too.
Means nothing. Especially in games. But also something is, you know, is fun the fundamental aspect by which we should judge games, or how important is it to our judgment of what makes a game good or great?
What does good mean?
Well, we discussed that on a podcast several weeks ago, talking about the greatest games of all time. Go back and listen to ourselves then to see the lack of a conclusion we come to on that front as well. But how important is it to, theoretically, what makes a game good or great? How important is that fun factor, and is that different from how we would judge movies and television and theater and music or tabletop games or sports or anything like that? And is fun, like, is there... like, why do we consider games fun that if I were to describe them to you would not seem like a fun experience? Games that are super difficult, or games that are horror games, or all sorts of stuff like that. Why does that trigger that fun impulse in us, even if those are emotions that I would not generally in real life associate with a fun time? So that's a lot of questions to unpack in the next, now 40 to 53 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Emma, do you have any preferences on where we start? I have lots of places I could dive in here.
No, just dive us in. It's your show.
Don't even give me that amount of power. Okay, so one of the things that really was sort of my first driving impulse towards this, other than Twitter, as always, apparently, is that fun really seems to be kind of a primary part of how we evaluate games and video games in particular, in a way that it's not for a movie or a piece of theater or a television show. But on the other hand, like tabletop games or sports, or even I think music in some ways, sometimes. Fun, although maybe the way we talk about fun and music is a little bit different. But it has more, we see fun being used in those kinds of worlds, which makes sense. Sports and tabletop games are games. Maybe. Anyway, how do we define
I wouldn't, tabletop games is such a broad category of things. So there's tons of board games that, quote unquote, aren't fun.
Right. So I was talking to my boyfriend about this, and he was talking to me about this game that basically you simulate creating a language, and it's really, really frustrating the whole time, and nobody understands each other. But then at the end, like, you've done it. And it's this really satisfying experience. Mm-hmm. Which, again, it's like, do you call that fun? We'll talk about the definition of fun in a minute. But the point being that, hey, at least in movies and theater and television, fun is generally used to mean, like, it's kind of a pejorative a lot of the time. It's like, oh yeah, that movie was fun. And not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but by calling something fun, you've made the distinction between, oh, it's not really like art. It's not really like great. It's fun. Which I think when we talk about, you can see that happen in the discourse with games sometime too. Like, oh, this game is just fun. But I feel like there's something much more fundamental, about how we talk about fun when we're evaluating games than in other media. Like, you kind of can go both ways. So, like, on the one hand, you can use this as a pejorative, but on the other hand, if I write a review and I'm mostly talking about the socio-political context of a game or, like, my experience of a game or whatever, you'll get all the people in the comments being like, yeah, but, like, was it fun? So it's this weird middle ground. So I don't know. I want to open it up to talk about, like, do we feel like fun is I think it has to be somewhat more baked into what a video game is than other kind of screen-based, anyway, forms of media.
Yeah. So the way I see, like, people using fun is that's sort of like it could be a defensive mechanism too, right? Like, oh, I play games for fun, which, is just a statement. It's a neutral statement. But when you're applying that to something else of like, oh, somebody's looking at a game with a deeper lens, let's say, you never, I don't think it's the prerogative of every person who plays a video game to examine it with a deep lens. I think it's always good to have your mind open and whatever and be aware of things in the game, but sometimes you're just playing it for fun and that's fine. But, like, there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction of, like, when somebody criticizes a game that you had fun with as being like, oh, like, let's say it doesn't treat its female characters very well or something. And you're like, oh, but it was fun. I had fun with it. It was fun. It's just for fun, Sort of like a word you can use that devalues it for the purpose of defending it.
Right. It exempts you as the player and further the creators as the makers of it for any kind of responsibility for any messages in it if it's just for fun.
Right.
Which is something we see happen in other forms of entertainment media as well. But I do think in games it's very forward in the discourse in a way that, if I'm just thinking of like movie criticism, it just isn't. we've pretty well established at this, I hope we've pretty well established at this point that movies can be about more than having fun.
Yeah.
I think that that's pretty baked in.
I mean, I think you see a similar reaction sometimes with the franchise movies right now, right? Whether it's criticizing what the content is or just the fact that everything's owned by one corporation.
Yeah.
And then you get people who enjoy them being like, oh, but they're fun. They're fun, though. I have fun with them, you know? And is a way to sort of avoid trying to think about anything else.
Well, it's a way to avoid responsibility.
Yeah.
Which is weird, right? If I told you that I had fun, I don't know, throwing puppies off of buildings.
It's not quite equivalent to that.
I know it's not equivalent to that. If I told you I had fun, I don't know. I guess if I it goes along with kind of the trolling mentality, right? If I told you I had fun being nasty to strangers online, even that I realize is not quite the same, but you would never be like, oh, well, that makes it fine.
Well, for me, I think more the issue is that people don't, there's a reactionary idea that, like, if something's fun, you can't have fun with something that has issues.
Right.
Right? Like, you can't look at something and be like, this has issues, but also I find it really fun. And, like, there's this resistance to reconciling those two ideas, right? You just want something to be fun or for something to have issues.
Well, but in the converse way, though, it's, something that deals with something serious can't be fun. I mean, it can be fun, but you have these, like, two kind of parallel things of if it's fun, it can't have a deeper meaning. And if it's fun, I don't have to be responsible for any potentially damaging meanings it has.
Yeah. I do think the reverse can be limiting when it comes to storytelling, though, of thinking, like, in terms of being a creator and thinking, like, oh, I want to address these serious topics, but it can't be fun because I'm addressing them, right? So
there was some good writing that I was looking at about games for change or serious games, however you want to, they referred to it kind of interchangeably as both. And something that I think we experienced at the Games for Change conference that we went to a couple summers ago is that, a lot of these games aren't, like, as quote-unquote fun as normal games. Mm-hmm. Partially just because of the money associated with them versus the money associated with, again, quote-unquote normal games. Mm-hmm. But also just because they had a different goal. And I saw a bunch of papers that were like, for serious games to really be effective, they have to become fun like normal games. Which, on one hand, feels very intuitive to me. Of course, you want these games, like, you want more people to play them, you want more people to want to play them, so it would make sense to make them more fun. But on the other hand, no one would ever tell you if you were making, like, a serious, dark movie, like, you have to make this more fun so people will come to see it.
Now, to be fair, I think this is a good way to transition into, like, a definition of fun. But, like, I can't bring myself to watch a lot of peak TV, or whatever, like, TV shows that people love. Because I'm just, like, it's gonna be so, like, unrelentingly grim. And that's not something I enjoy. And I feel like games run into this problem sometimes, too, where it's, like, to be, like, really serious, they feel like they have to be sort of these dark, gritty things that never, veer into anything approaching levity, right? Which I don't think is the best storytelling method, so I tend to avoid them. But that's different. Like, I've played games or sections of games that I would call not fun, but I also didn't find them, like, oppressively grim either, or oppressively challenging, or oppressively anything. But that's something that comes across all medias for me, in that, like, sometimes, like, any Oscar movie that, like, it's like The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio. Like, I had absolutely no interest in seeing that. I don't care that it was, like, a showcase for his acting or whatever. It just sounded like a horrible time. Yeah, that's like the clearest example in other medias I can like remember.
Well, I was thinking of, you remember when we saw Inside Llewyn Davis?
See, I liked Inside Llewyn Davis.
No, it was so boring.
I liked it a lot.
It was so boring.
I wouldn't call that movie fun, but I enjoyed that movie.
Sure. So fine. That still gets at the idea of what I was trying to get at. And I think that there are a lot of different ways. God, this is going to sound so obvious, but I promise it's a jumping off point for stuff. There are a lot of different ways in which something can be not fun.
Yeah.
Right? One way it can be not fun is we can watch Leonardo DiCaprio eat bear poop or whatever it was in that movie.
Yeah.
Right? Wasn't it something like that?
I think he just had to kill a bear or something. I don't think it was eating his poop.
I feel like he had to eat something gross in that movie, and I can't
like
remember.
Raw bear or something.
I think it was grosser than that, but that's fine. There could be, like, things can be not fun in the sense that they are, like, emotionally punishing. Mm-hmm. Whether that's because they are just brutally gross, like Leonardo DiCaprio, whether, for me, I thought Inside Llewyn Davis was just, like, oppressive. Well, no, actually, I think that's distinct. I'm going to put that in its own category. I'll come back to it. It can be just, like, incredibly super violent. Games, I feel like, rarely tread into that category because we're kind of used to it, but it can be so gruesomely violent that it's hard to watch. It can be so super, super sad that it's hard to watch, right? If just, like, brutally, like, there's no way out, super sad, right? We have those kind of categories where it's, like, really draining. Theoretically, the idea of what you're getting at from those is either you're appreciating the technical performances or you're getting some kind of major, like, ancient Greek catharsis from it, like fully purging the bad emotions.
Sure,
right?
But I think that even if you go too far, you sort of miss that catharsis.
Sure, totally.
You shoot over it to, like, just, deadness, basically.
Sure, 100%. But then there's other categories of not fun. There's not fun of, I don't have any idea what's going on, right? I have nothing to grasp onto here. There's
Confusion.
not fun of, this is very boring, right? There's not fun of, this is requiring a lot of intellectual work for me when I don't want it to be. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I could continue to go on. There's not fun of, I feel like the intellectual work kind of maps onto, this is very challenging, possibly, in some ways, in games.
In games, I think for me, what a lot of has come from is this feels unfair. When something's unfair, it becomes something, draining rather than something.
But I guess what I'm trying to get at is that in a lot of ways, certainly in movies, we reward things that are very draining in some way or another. Right? Either because they are emotionally taxing or because they are so conceptual that you cannot blink or you will miss an important symbol.
Right.
Remember Tree of Life?
I never saw Tree of Life.
But, like,
I do remember
the
it.
existence of Tree of Life.
Yeah.
Or they are so very boring, like Inside Llewyn Davis. I don't mean to be, like, hating on Inside Llewyn Davis. I just, like, one of the few movies I remember going to and being like, this is so dull. Like, I didn't even think it was, like, aggressively sad or anything, because it wasn't. He's just, like, a failed musician. But, like...
It's, like, vaguely depressing, but it's not aggressively sad.
I was just like, this is boring.
I mean, I like that movie.
Whatever. I mean, that's fine. That's your right. You're welcome to like it. That's going to be part of this discussion, no doubt. But you can also have things that are just, like, very, very boring, and that's why they're not fun, because they're boring.
Yeah.
However, in games, I feel like even though we have this established precedent of fun versus enjoyable in other forms of screen media, that's, like, very well established, we can enjoy the quality of something even if it's not super fun. Even if it's not necessarily what you or I would seek out, I'm also very behind on peak prestige TV. Just because I'm enjoying other things right now. But I was also thinking about Breaking Bad, and, like, that was you probably wouldn't think it was a fun show, but that show was fun because it just, like, drove you forward and you wanted to know what was next. And it didn't, even though it still has issues, right? We're not really, it still holds up Walt as the hero when, like, he is not the hero.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I mean, is fun the right word for that, though, do you think?
I do think with something like Breaking Bad, fun is the right word. Yeah. Because there's something about the drive of it moving forward and the plot basis of it that, to me, checks the fun box in a way that something like, I don't know, I haven't seen Mad Men, but in a way that it seems to me like Mad Men is not like that.
Oh, I've just, started Mad Men 4 times.
Whereas the enjoyable factor from that comes from, these are very interesting characters. This is a great performance. Whatever. Right. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong. And this is not me saying there's anything wrong with enjoying that, obviously. But it's not...
I have a tendency to, distinguish between, fun and engaging. I guess. So, this just might be our differing definitions, but, what you describe with Breaking Bad is something I would call engaging versus fun. And obviously I'm speaking that as an outsider perspective, sure, because I have not seen Breaking Bad, and I don't really have any plans to see Breaking Bad. Sure. But in terms of, the drive of things moving and wanting to know what happens next, it seems to fall under more you're very engaged with it versus just... I don't know. And that's fun can be part of engagement, but it feels like it's something slightly distinct from that.
So let's try to unpack this, because to me, it wasn't just the drive of what's going next there, and I need to shift our focus to games, because I've been doing a lot of, around game examples. Uh-huh. But there was something about, the bigness of Breaking Bad, too, that also played into the fun of it. But because I don't have a good definition of fun that I'm working from right now, that is a little bit hard to describe. So I want to kind of try to unpack that, because maybe it's wrong to describe something that isn't interactive as fun at all.
I guess.
That's just an idea I was floating. Depends on how you define fun.
Yeah. I think that's taking it a step too far of saying what fun is.
Well, let me throw you some ideas from the game design world about what fun is, and we'll see what you think.
Okay,
so one of them, first of all, my first quote comes from Chris Crawford, who's the founder of GDC. His quote is, "Fun is the emotional response to learning."
Okay. So
to build on that, there's this very influential theory of fun, he calls it, from Raf Koster, who's a game designer. Basically, it's built on the idea that games are more or less, what they do is they train our brain to identify patterns. And they give us training in patterns that we then go on to use in life. And fun is the neurochemical reward for mastering a pattern or understanding something new. This, of course, puts a lot of, it makes games very powerful things, right? But that's, more or less his idea of fun. That fun is this, reward when we learn something or when we figure something out. Which I at first was very skeptical of, but the more I thought about it, the more it does allow for us to kind of leapfrog a lot of the problems with calling games that are super difficult or punishing in some way fun.
See, the initial idea of learning something and getting it feels like satisfaction to me. But I can see how fun could then be using that new knowledge afterwards and seeing it be successful. Right? Of being able to use your new understanding of something.
Yeah.
But the initial feeling I would define as satisfaction, not necessarily as immediately fun.
I think he calls it delight. That moment of having figured it out.
Yeah. That also works, I think.
But I do think it's a neat little definition that explains, why we like super hard games like Cuphead, or why we like games that kill characters that we care about, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's one idea to throw out there. Did you know that the internet's favorite hater Ian Bogost is like, does work on this kind of stuff.
I don't. Ian Bogost, is he a real human being? I don't know.
He is. He's given like all these keynotes. Like he founded this idea called persuasive games. He seems to have a lot of belief in the power of games to like do stuff for someone that thinks like gameplay is bad.
Yeah.
I realize a lot of his articles are like sort of tongue-in-cheek maybe, or he's telling some joke that he's not being clear about, but that was another little bit of an inspiration for this, his recent article on The Atlantic about why labor in games is bad.
Yeah.
I would really like his take on Death Stranding. Because in that article, he seems to, like, he de-implicates walking simulators a little bit. He's like, these take away, like, the pressure to do anything. And it's like, would you enjoy this game that is mostly about walking?
But there's a lot of labor involved in that walking, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're not just, like, walking and looking at things. Like, you are, in Death Stranding, you are carrying stuff, and the smallest little pebble makes you drop all that stuff if you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
Right? And you'll come across obstacles, and you have to build things so that you can get across. Right? So it's not just, like when it comes to talking about, like, labor in games, like, Death Stranding is just, like, yeah, here's your labor, gamers.
True.
Get to it.
Maybe we'll come back to this idea of labor. To quote Julian Kuchlich. Don't know if that's how you pronounce it.
Is that right?
Labor. Okay, but another good theory of fun comes from Marc LeBlanc, who was also a game developer. He worked at Looking Glass. He worked at Sega. He worked on Thief, we've talked about on the show, among other games. And he presents this theory, and it goes along with the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics framework. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah, I think so.
But he presents this theory of 8 kinds of fun that I want to kind of read off for you. So basically that there are like 8 kinds of ways that we experience fun. So number 1 is sensation. Games as sense pleasure that evoke emotion in the player through sound, visuals, controller, rumble, or physical effort. The examples included on wherever I pulled this from are Dead Space, Dance Dance Revolution, Candy Crush Saga.
Okay.
2, fantasy. Game as make-believe, meant to take the player to another world, escapism. So Final Fantasy, Nier Automata, Legend of Zelda.
I don't know if I quite agree with those examples, but okay.
Sure. 3, third type of fun is narrative. Game meant to tell a story. Narrative fun.
Okay.
4, challenge. Game as obstacle course. Provides with competitive value or increasingly difficult challenges.
Okay.
5, fellowship. Game as social framework. Games that have social interactions as a core or a big feature. 6, discovery. Game as uncharted territory in which the player explores the world he/she finds himself, herself in, themself in. 7, expression. Game as self-discovery. Games that allow for self-expression from the player through gameplay, such as Minecraft or Roblox, that kind of thing. And 8, submission. Games as pastime. Games that have farming or grinding as a core element, featuring, naturally, Farmville, and also last week's old game, Disgaea. Thoughts on that?
I mean, it doesn't... I don't know how specific to fun that is. That just feels like you're breaking down, like, game goals.
Well, it comes from that kind of game design perspective, so that's not entirely surprising. But I think what he's trying to outline here is different ways in which you can create fun for the player, sort of in different spheres. So, are you trying to create a game that features escapism, discovery, and, I don't know, expression? maybe you've created Breath of the Wild, right?
Sure.
Or are you trying to create a game that's narrative, I don't know, and submission? You've created one of those, like, ongoing, like, story novel things that are popular in Japan, right? So it gives you an idea of the kind of mechanics to include to create certain types of fun. I mean, I think it's helpful in terms of thinking about different ways of enjoyability. That said, I sort of feel like I agree that I don't know that necessarily all of these things would hit specifically like fun.
Yeah.
Like, narrative in particular feels like you're using fun in a different way there than you would be with, like, the fun of escapism or the fun of a challenge.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, suffice it to say, when I picked this topic, I did not think that defining fun was going to be the major challenge.
I mean, that's like the first thing you have to do in a paper, right? You have to define your terms.
Don't I know it?
Because you can't be like, is this fun, without understanding what you're asking when you say that. And if you don't know what fun means, then you don't know what you're asking.
It's true. So clearly I still don't know what I'm asking.
And maybe it's just what's the quote on obscenity from that guy?
You know it when you see it.
Yeah, you know fun when you see it.
But you don't. Okay, so fine. Even if I put aside the definition of fun for now, I think that there are a lot of ways I can point to games and say, well, aren't we still mostly operating in a very narrow definition of what fun can be? Or at least of what enjoyable can be.
See, I don't know if the issue is, like, I don't think we have to redefine fun. I think more it's that fun doesn't have to be the primary thing that a game does.
So that's what I'm kind of wondering, though. Is it just cultural that we expect that games have a primary thing that they are fun? Or does it have something more to do with the medium itself? That's almost something that we necessarily have to grapple with?
Well, I mean, the basis of games was, like, you know, it gives people something to do, right? Like, video games arose from those very simple kind of games where somebody, you know, made a ball and kicked it back and forth with a friend, or they made up some sort of game with sticks or something. I don't know if these are real things. I'm just going with it. But, you know, like, the basic games are very old. So is basic theater, which is basically, you know, what TV and movies and stuff are. But, like, they're also very simple from there, right? And you could say that the primary purpose of those games was fun and social interaction. I'm sure there are also games that had ceremonic or, you know,
no, sure, the Olympics.
Yeah. Or some other kind of purpose. But at the end of the day, if you're like, let's go out and kick the ball around, like, what's your primary purpose there? It's to have fun. So because video games have arisen from that more simplistic tradition, and whatever, you could get into sports as theater or whatever, but when you're just playing with your friend, it's a fun thing.
Sure.
You're doing it for fun. You're on recess, and you're trying to have fun during recess. So there's a more understanding of games as being something that is fun, right? Something that you do for fun.
Yeah.
And even when you start adding the stories and characters and colors to it, there's still this sort of idea that the base part of a game is about the mechanics and the fun of those mechanics, right?
Yeah.
Differently than other things. You know, like the stuff that evolved, like whatever, theater's fun. Theater can be fun. Well, but I feel like there's a more...
mean, Emma, but yes.
I feel like if you go back through performance history, there's more of like and with music too, there's a more varied purposes to them. Whether they're sort of worshipful or a way of carrying on history or whatever. So that when they evolve into more complex things, we've already been using performance for more complex things. right?
Yeah, I hadn't
Whereas
thought about that.
Yeah, again, this would be something to do more research on, but it does feel like there's more of like, if you get down to the core of what a game is, you just end up with something that's fun. But that doesn't take into account the elements of performance that video games have brought into games.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. That because all of these other media evolved through phases in which they were being used for something more serious, that they already have that long-standing foundation of people taking them seriously or of using them for things that are not just pure enjoyment anyway. And a lot of them really had to evolve specifically into things that were meant for pure enjoyment, right? Like I'm thinking music in particular. For a long time, that was not really the purpose of music, right?
Right.
But with games, they've always been a leisure activity. And I guess then that leads to the question, though, does that have to be the case? How does the industry move into a territory where it can create things that don't have to be fun? Because fun is probably the number one way to keep someone playing a game, right?
Right.
And for whatever reason, we're more likely to put down a game than we are to walk out of a movie.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I find really interesting, and maybe this comes into, like, crossing it with performance again, but, like, you know, there's tons of board games and tabletop RPGs and LARPs that are definitely not meant to be fun.
Right.
But people get super into them anyway. You know, like all those, we learned a lot about like Norwegian or Scandinavian or whatever LARPs and like the stuff that they do up there of like, you know, there's LARPs where like you pretend like it's like Holocaust LARPs or not. I don't remember if it was specifically that, but like, or they just like go out into the wilderness and survive for a week and while playing roles or whatever, or they simulate like climbing like a really tall mountain and whatever. It's like none of that's fun. None of those are what I would traditionally call fun. But you know, people go out and do it still.
And even if you were to lump that into a definition of fun, that's just like, well, people get some kind of enjoyment out of doing this, right? Even if that was going to be your definition of fun, is like, people get some enjoyment from this somehow and consider it a net positive experience at the end, right? I think that's a pretty weak definition of fun, but let's just say it. Even within that, I think that games only utilize a pretty narrow slice of what that is right now.
Yeah.
And that was really highlighted by a lot of the discourse around Death Stranding this week for me. Because so much of it was about, like, this game is boring.
Yeah.
Right? And for some reviewers and some just general Twitterers, that was really damning feedback. Say, this game is boring. Why would I play it?
Yeah.
And then for other reviewers, the fact that it was boring, I mean, clearly is part of the story. Right? The kind of journeys that you're taking and the difficulty of connecting makes it that much more beautiful when you come across the perfect bridge that someone has made, or when somebody has turned your little ladder into a highway, or something like that.
I did respect Jason Schreier from Kotaku being like, I have a baby, I can't play Death Stranding.
Yeah.
Like, I respect that.
Yeah.
It's like his controller started crying, and he was like, nope. Nope out of that.
To be fair, he probably more or less plays Death Stranding on, like, a daily basis.
Yeah. But something particularly interesting is, like, and you see this a lot with a lot of games, but something that's come up with Death Stranding of, like, oh, it gets good after the first 10 hours.
Right. If you can get to Chapter 3.
It becomes a lot more open and fun. And it's like, I can understand why that's damning for a lot of people, right? Because, man, games do demand a lot of your time. right?
Yeah.
And even when you play games and review them for a living, like, you don't have that much time for games when there's so many coming out all the time. And if you have just a normal job where you're working, again, you don't have that much time for games. And when every game that comes out nowadays is like 100 hours long, it becomes kind of exhausting. So when you hear a game doesn't get good until like the first 10 hours, I can understand the knee-jerk gut reaction away from that. But at the same time, that's like part of the appeal of games.
That's part of the storytelling and part of the world building in this particular game and in plenty of games.
I like the most like, maybe it's just Japanese games in general, but especially JRPGs, I always hear someone being like, oh, you just have to get through the first 10 hours and then it really gets good, which is honestly not really an experience I've had, I don't think. Like, even with JRPGs, I've never, like, gone into it and been like, oh man, the first 10 hours are such a slog.
Well, I think it comes from a place of fear and self-consciousness when people say that. They're recommending you something that they like enough to tell you that you should play. Right? And they're worried that you're not going to give it the chance that it deserves because you maybe don't have the same experience or you might not connect to it in the same way, and fun is subjective, right? So I often think that more comes from a place of, like, I'm nervous that you're not going to like this thing that I like, than genuine concern. That said, it also comes from a place of these games have to teach mechanics that many people will be familiar with at the beginning, or they don't, and you're going to have a hard time at the beginning. So it's tricky to kick off a game because you're walking this balancing act of, am I going to bore people that are familiar with this genre already, or am I going to throw people in and risk losing people because they don't know what they're doing?
Yeah. It's like, I remember when Persona 5 came out, for instance, which I think is funny in retrospect, of like people being like, you know, I think it's because it throws so many tutorials at you for so long, but they're like, oh, you just gotta get through the first 10 hours, which I always think is funny because I think like the first part of that game is one of the strongest parts of the game, if not the strongest part.
Well, they don't give you nearly as much freedom, right? Once you get past the first palace, you suddenly have the ability to manage your whole schedule.
Right. I think that's a similar thing to what people are talking about with Death Stranding, right?
Yeah.
It starts giving you a lot more options after the first 10 hours.
The difference being, though, that also what I've heard about that game is you get a lot of access to a lot more assistive technology that makes the brutal walking maybe a little bit less brutal, or at least into a little bit more of a, you're putting yourself into crazy challenging situations voluntarily kind of scenario. Whereas with Persona...
It's like the part of Persona 5 where it makes you navigate the subway system.
Exactly. It's exactly
before it gives
like
you
that.
fast travel.
Shibuya. This is Shibuya.
I'm sure most people who play that game spent like 20 minutes walking around that subway station.
Yeah. But I just think it's different. I think in that game, it's fundamentally a difficulty thing and a boredom. Like a different kind of boredom.
Right. But it was like you were saying earlier of, like, that first part being part of the storytelling, right? Like, would a game that intentionally gives you limited options and sort of restrictions on what you can do for the first 5 hours be a fundamentally different game if they're trying to be quote-unquote fun from the get-go? And I think, yes.
Definitely. It just comes down to a lack of trust. Right? In the same way as we don't trust our friend to push through the parts of the game that aren't like the meat of the game or what we would consider the best parts of the game, right? Game designers don't always trust that players are going to stick with them through parts of the game that are intentionally frustrating or that are intentionally boring or that are intentionally sad or not fun in any number of ways.
I mean, when I was trying to think of, like, right before we started this, I was trying to think of examples of games that I didn't find what I would call fun at certain points. And a lot of the examples I came up with were moments from closer to the end of the game when probably they're pretty confident that, you know, you're there.
Yeah.
For the rest of it because you put however many hours into it already. and there were a lot less examples that I could think of that was like the start of the game is not fun.
Which makes sense, because they'll lose you.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, like, the start of The Last of Us is not something I would call fun, but it's not boring either.
Is that because I'm just especially bad at those mechanics, though? I've played the beginning of The Last of Us.
I mean the very beginning of The Last of Us.
Oh, okay, fine.
The cold open.
Sure.
Let's call it.
Sure.
Right, but that, like, people cite that as being like, oh, it's got me now after that cold open. But it's not a fun experience to watch the events that lead up to Sarah's death.
Sure.
Like, whatever, it's been out that long. The second one's coming out, I can say that.
Yeah.
But it's not, like, it just, it's sort of similar feeling of, like, you were talking about with Breaking Bad, of, like, you want to know what's going to happen.
Right.
Right? Which is why, like, I'm more leaning towards engaging as a word for that than fun.
That makes sense. Sure. I guess more what I'm looking at is, games that dare to not... Well, I don't know. I'm just excited to see gameplay continue to evolve, is I guess what I'm saying. Is games continue to find new ways to get me engaged in the game or invested in the game in some way that don't have to be the same half a dozen ways that we invest in games in, like, 75% of games.
Yeah. It's something else I was thinking about, because I was making a list, like I said, of games that were not fun, both in bad ways and good ways, and I put Final Fantasy 15 on both of those lists. And, like, the more we talk about stuff and the further away we get from it, like, the more I appreciate what that game was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because I could think of, like, two distinct moments where they kind of, like, one, the terrible chapter 13. That was something that was not fun in a bad way by the end of it. Because it was just too long and too confusing, and there were so many enemies, and you were alone. And just a whole bunch of things. I think the key part is that it was too long of not fun.
But would you say that was ultimately part of it? Like, do you think that the idea of being alone without weapons is highlighted by having to spend more time than is comfortable in that state?
Maybe. But the other example I was going to use is one of your party members goes blind near the middle of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And the very first mission where you have to go out in the field and be back with him, if like, he's walking slower.
Yeah.
And every time you pick up the pace too much, one of your other party members says, "Knocked!"
Yeah.
So you have to, like, consciously make Knocked kind of walk and not get ahead too far out of consideration for this other party member. And that was, like, a situation that really worked for me. Like, it was like an incredibly awkward, in all sense of the words, like, situation in that game that was just, like, imbued with this sense of awkwardness and not talking to each other and not being considerate of each other. That kind of really worked. So I really, like, the more we think about it, the more I appreciate just, like, how far that game tried to take itself.
Yeah.
Right? Like, in a lot of ways, I think it failed because it didn't quite go far enough in that it starts getting caught up in the traditional, Final Fantasy trappings by the end of it.
Yeah.
But, like, the fact that it tried to push itself in those ways. And I think it probably ends up being a mixed bag just because of how chaotic the development was.
Sure.
But, there's all these sort of instances in that game where it's not fun, It's just sort of like something else that you can't quite put your finger on.
Well, I'm excited to see how many games begin to experience or experiment with boredom and with awkwardness and with frustration more, apart from just difficulty.
Right.
To create different ways of telling stories and different ways of ultimately paying that off in engagement, enjoyability, or even, yes, fun. Which seems like as good a place as any to leave it. So listeners, hey, if you got a definition of fun that you feel like is better than our lack of definition we settled on, love to hear it. Have you played games that you found to be engaging, enjoyable, satisfying that you would not describe as fun? Do you have an idea for a game that would bore you to sleep? Boredom, very in right now. Supposed to make you creative. Very hip to be bored.
Very hip.
So.
Very hip and happening, boredom.
It's having a moment, boredom. If so, hit us up on our social media and let us know. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talk This, and we're on, at Talk This Podcast. Yikes. Not just at Talk This, at Talk This Podcast.
Come on, Madelyn, how many times have you done this
I'm sorry. I got a little creative there from all my boredom.
Slipping.
I was trying to shake it up. But also at YouTube at Talk This Sisters. So let us know about your various thoughts on games and fun in games on those platforms. You can also reach out to us through the contact page on our website, www.talkthispodcast.com. While you're there, you can see the games that are in the hat, read our blog featuring long-running series, both Back from the Dead, Clickbait Boyfriend, and Split Screen, plus all sorts of other game thoughts, that kind of thing, and read more about us and the show and all that good stuff. Plus, you can see a complete list of our episodes, but I'll tell you where to find them now in case for some reason you're allergic to the web. So you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Pandora Podcasts. Pretty much anywhere that anyone has ever listened to a podcast, you will find Talk This. It's dangerous to podcast alone.
And if we're not there, let us know. We'll be there.
Yeah, we're happy to be there. If we are not there, it's just because we don't know about it. Not for a lack of love. So that's more or less it from us this week. Tune in next time to hear us talk about 2 games. Think I'd heard of them.
Talk about something quickly. Wait.
You're like, Talk This is like always saying like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if games did things in a different way? But they always do the end of their episode the exact same way.
Oh, Halo.
Oh, yes.
And Astral Chain.
Nice. Yes, it was 2 games I had heard of. See? I know a little.
There you go.
So tune in to listen to us talk about the chain of Astral Halos that we will no doubt create as the mashup. It's going to be a good one. It always is. I'm looking forward to it. So, Emma, thanks for another fun time here this week. Do you want me to sign off? Do you want to sign off?
I can sign off.
Go for it.
Listeners, I hope you have a fun week.